Well, so the other thing is that you can just go to those firms and say, "Hey, look, I've got 1,000 clients paying X dollars. And I know that one of them is going to have a car accident this year. So why don't I pay you a monthly fee? And then when one of my clients needs you, you step in."
Thank you, and welcome to Law Subscribed. This is your dedicated news source for all things subscriptions and the law. My name is Matthew Kurbis. I'm an attorney who believes subscriptions can help bridge the access to justice gap and incentivize attorneys to modernize and scale their practice like never before. I'm talking about more affordable legal services for everyday people and more predictable revenue for attorneys to help them pay down those six-figure student loans. In my third episode, I chat with Reuben Metcalfe, an entrepreneur in the legal space and beyond. Reuben knows a lot about the legal industry, but doesn't have the same functional fixedness of one entrenched in this profession. Reuben and I discuss his ideas and perspectives on how the subscription model can be applied to legal services. It was a great conversation, and without further delay, here's the interview. I think of you as one of the most interesting people I've met in the internet age. I guess I would define you as just an entrepreneurial innovator, a unique thinker, and a connector. And some of the things that you've done are legal tangential or directly related to the U.S. legal system. And so when I think of you, Reuben, that's what I think of. But for my audience, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Reuben Metcalfe. I like long walks by the beach. I have lived here in America for about 10 years, although originally I'm from New Zealand by way of Australia and Japan for 2.5 years, respectively. My exploits have ranged from importing paint from Japan to New Zealand, heavy-duty anti-corrosive steel primer paint to be applied at 192 microns thick. I'm glad you asked. And also, oh boy, I stacked fish. That's not a euphemism. I literally put pallets on, boxes on pallets rather. I picked apples. I started a utilities brokerage firm where I brokered energy and telco. I wasn't allowed to broker insurance, but I was allowed to broker insurance brokers. So technically I was a broker briefly. And then I tried to do a thing that was a little bit like a space lottery. Turns out that violates a bunch of international gaming laws. So I definitely did not run a lottery or a sweepstakes. What you are allowed to do, and what we did, was you're allowed to sell a slightly larger piece of paper. Now you are a poster company running a sales promotion as defined by the New Zealand Gambling Act of 2003. So we started a poster company for a free chance to go to space, market value poster. And we never quite hit the threshold. So we gave everyone a refund and mothballed it. But I hear Branson is launching these days, finally, 10 years later, Richard. But yeah, in the meantime, very nearly built 26,000 websites for the National Parent-Teacher Association. Was over at Samsung as their guinea pig EIR for a while. Ran a bunch of hackathons in space, or aero, astro, so like planes and cars, and then spent 4 years in complex litigation, as you do. Not as a subject of the matter, but rather the system thereof. Yeah, making class actions not suck so hard, basically.
Yeah. A noble cause, I think.
That was, you know what? That was the first one that I started because I was frustrated. Most of the ones that I'd started before that is because I was inspired by making the world more awesome. This one, we were just making it suck less hard. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. And the years that you spent doing that, you got to know lawyers and the legal system fairly well, wouldn't you say?
There's a thing I use called Brainscape, which is a neat name. It's one of those space repetition apps, and it'll teach you, Japanese, or it'll teach you, some other sort of. It's good for like data sets that you want to sort of cram into your onboard RAM, if you will. Less good for like nuance, but it just sort of shows you multi-choice questions than sort of, if you forget the things, it'll show you the questions more. I took the California bar simulator on it, and I'm getting 69% on the contract law section. Not bad for a high school dropout. So between that and reading many, like literally hundreds of 20 to 120 page settlement agreements, I learned all sorts of fun words like numerosity, and blow provisions, and the aforementioned, prior to the conversation, obstreperous, which is my favorite word, from Judge Kennelly in Chicago. Yeah, all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm.
Well, but my practice doesn't incorporate class actions. It hasn't ever, and I don't know that it ever will. But of course, I learned about it in law school, and I certainly followed the news and processed that from a legal perspective. And I've been included in some class actions just in light of being a human being existing in society. The Illinois biometric data violation by Facebook. Yeah. I'm a class
Thanks,
member,
Elizabeth.
being an Illinois resident. And even as an attorney, it's so difficult to fight those things and to object or to reject, the settlement, that I'll just take my $500 or less at this point. But what you were doing, I mean, really would have, had I known about it before I gave away my ability to pursue Facebook, and for what my actual damages might be, maybe I would have, picked a different route. But to get into why I've asked you on here, well, your background doesn't really have anything to do with subscriptions. However, since I like the way that your mind works, and we had a great pre-interview chat, I'd love to sort of dive into your thoughts on my ideas for the subscription model applied to law, which I think is also there. I'm pursuing this in a similar way, where I want to make the legal profession and legal services suck less for consumers and for lawyers. And I think the subscription model is part of that. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to explore it as in depth as I can, so that it's done right, that it's not done so it's bad for the consumers of legal services, so it's not bad for lawyers. So with that, you had some really interesting ideas. So there's a few different ways you could tackle the subscription model. You can, two of those ways that I've seen in the legal profession so far is you tackle the bigger fish. You get your companies, you get them paying you, $1,000 minimum a month, maybe more. You just need a handful of clients, and you're doing okay as an attorney, and that's okay. The other side is there's a blue ocean of people out there not getting access to legal services, and you could charge them significantly less. I've seen some things like this out there. Law on Call is one of them. It's part of the re-regulation that's going on in Utah and Arizona right now. I think it's like $10 or $15 a month. You could talk to a lawyer for 15 minutes. And then if you need legal services, they actually charge you by the hour. So it's not quite the full-on subscription model, but it's something like that. So something that you were talking about, though, that I would like you to go into a little bit more is how if you say, look at the needs of a particular group set, like a dentist, you could see what their needs are, and you could build a subscription model around that. Yeah. So, explain your thought process there.
So in this case, I'm borrowing from insurance. Let's say that you look at a product like health insurance, right? Okay, that's a single product. Person pays a single premium, and if something happens, then you look at the policy and see if it's covered, right? So on the back end, picture yourself as the person trying to create the policy, right? Not necessarily the broker, but maybe the underwriter, or maybe even the people who sort of check the box on the underwriters, right? The reinsurers. And so your job, the first thing you got to figure out is what I might be on the hook for in reality, right? And so you take maybe all the parts of the body and you say, okay, spleens. what kind of annual spleen damage is there? Oh, the average person has an X% chance of having spleens spontaneously combust, and that costs Y dollars, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we're going to take that 0% chance of $1 million of damage and factor that into a $0 premium per annum. And you do that for every sort of spleen-related condition, and then presumably the legs and other parts of the bodies, and then the biome and all the other parts of what makes us us. And eventually you have a number, and that is the probabilistic likelihood of an individual experiencing things that an insurance policy might cover, and the sort of frequency and scope of that in terms of the volume that you might be on the hook for, et cetera. And you take that number and you divide it over 12 easy payments of whatever, and you minus 20%. Oh, sorry, and then you add 20%, and that's the premium for the customer, right? Basically gambling, but you're not allowed to call it that. So in this scenario, I would say you do the same thing, right? You look at the average customer, right? And the truth is there's varying flavors of spaghetti sauces, borrowing from a TED talk where he talks about how there's no perfect spaghetti sauce. There's like some people like chunky, some people like this, and if you bash them up together, people get confused because you try to make something in the middle that doesn't work. Right. So in this scenario, we sort of look at the sort of normal small medium business, right, within maybe moderated by sector, right, dentistry versus accounting versus whatever. Do the same for individuals, consumers. You do the same for whatever class of individual that you're trying to build a product for. You look at their, you sort of zoom out to try to figure out what the total addressable market is. You zoom back in to try to figure out what the individual needs are. And then you start looking for outliers, right? Because the outliers, I think, are the kinds of things that break these models. And maybe you create separate conditions so that when you hit the threshold of those outliers, something else kicks into place, and maybe some sort of insurer comes in the back or something, right? To sort of cover those needs if suddenly somebody has a life event which might drastically increase their needs for legal services.
So for example, in part of the model that I'm thinking of, which is subscription plus flat fee, really completely eliminating the billable hour is, if somebody's only paying you X amount a month, you can only provide, so many legal services at whatever dollar amount that is that you've evaluated and strategized based on this data collection, and assessment that you're talking about. But then when they, and maybe that includes a certain set of legal services, but then they get in a car accident and you don't practice personal injury law. That would be one of these threshold moments, right? So, but you'd have to plan for that ahead of time. You can't just offer, say, here's $100 a month, legal services. The door is wide open. No, you'd have to maybe build that into whatever retainer agreement you have with the client, and then say, here's some attorneys, personal injury firms we work with. We refer you to. You don't have to take any of them if you don't want. But if you ever get in a personal injury accident, we're going to send you over there.
So the other thing is that you can just go to those firms and say, hey, look, I've got 1,000 clients paying X dollars. And I know that one of them is going to have a car accident this year. So why don't I pay you a monthly fee? And then when one of my clients needs you, you step in.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't considered the referral network that attorneys have of when you refer someone a case. In certain cases, you can't give referrals. In different states have different ethical rules around that.
Now.
Well, maybe it's definitely looking at the subscription model with how attorneys refer business back and forth is an interesting idea I want to play with. But at a bare minimum, you'd send them the case, and assuming it's allowed in your jurisdiction, you'd get a referral fee if they win or settle or something. Yeah. The other side of that is, maybe I can only offer advice over the phone with the subscription model that I've set up. Yeah. Yeah. But I also help people buy and sell homes. So I could charge them and maybe if they're not a subscriber, I charge them a certain amount of money, but then that threshold moment happens. And for the monthly subscription, maybe I found I could include real estate transactions in my monthly subscription, but maybe I can't. And so that would trigger an event. It'd be a flat fee. It'd be a lower flat fee than what I would charge if you weren't a subscriber. That kind of threshold. Different things happen, and you have to think about this and build it in.
Yeah. It's getting the stuff right is, I think, an actuarial issue. And anybody who sort of thinks in that way, I think, should be able to at least know where to look to find out which numbers matter. Some of the stuff you're talking about is putting like a ceiling and a floor on some of these, both in terms of the supply side from who is providing the legal services, and the demand side in terms of things that sort of break the model in terms of demand spikes, both in terms of the individual and the aggregate. My instinct as a technologist is to build a protocol that attorneys can sort of slot into with little check boxes for their areas of speciality, and to be able to contribute to pools of resource, which then sort of are allocated according to the demand profile of the citizenry. That's probably overkill for upfront. But if you're trying to solve it systemically, then that's the approach that one might consider.
Baby steps, Reuben. Baby steps here. Eventually,
I get excited.
Eventually, and hey, if there's enough of an interest in this, and the law subscribed brain trust grows, maybe there's a place to do it there. But there's another thing you said, and that we kind of talked about it, which is you have to know what your clients' needs are and the types of services you provide to them, right? So it's data collection. So that's something that sort of notoriously lawyers are bad at collecting and bad at visualizing. So attorneys are going to need a lot of help with that. I know that Clio publishes a lot of data. Clio is a practice management software. It does a lot of other things too. And they sort of publish this anonymized data, and they have access to a lot of that data. And so I'm not a Clio user, but I do wonder if, the attorneys that use some sort of practice management software, if they have access to that data. But I know that a lot of firms and a lot of small firms simply don't, and they just kind of go with their gut feeling on certain things. But that's not the way to do it. Like what you're talking about, you would actually need to collect and analyze data to make the best decision that you possibly could, to systematize it like you're talking about.
Yeah, there's also a number of gaps, I think, in the legal market globally, which is, I harp on about this, but there's legal rights that we'll go with consumer rights that exist that consumers are aware of, and consumer rights that exist that consumers are aware of that they have meaningful access to, right? And if we were to look at the frequency and scope of, let's say, injury, for example, the percentage of how many rights are sort of exercisable on a day-to-day basis, and how does that compare to the number of rights that are exercised on a day-to-day basis? And some of those might be sort of event-based, like, oh no, you got your chocolate on my peanut butter, what are we going to do about, or whatever. And then others are sort of like, at any time an individual can exercise whatever right. I think the concentricity of those circles is pretty serious when it comes to individual consumers. If you switch out that consumer part to the corporate part, I would say those circles are less concentric. That is, corporates broadly have greater awareness of and access to corporate legal rights. Maybe to the extent that the corporate circle is less concentric is to the extent which they're paying for it to be less concentric by way of third-party or in-house firms, right? But my guess is that to start with the baseline, you want to look at that smallest circle, because that's what's going to be representative of the client base. And then through the use of your wonderful service, you're going to be closing that delta a little bit and making those circles less concentric as you expand the awareness of and access to your customers' legal rights.
And there's also an education problem, right, with this, and that is that people don't know their rights, and people don't understand the law, and we should probably be teaching. Not everyone is like you, Reuben. They're going to go on apps like Brainscape and they're going to teach themselves things about the law. And you weren't even born here, right? And so you probably know.
No, it's weird. It's weird.
Right.
It's weird for Kiwis to come to America and stick around long, and it's weird. It's also weird for them to do anything touching law, right? And so I go back and they're like, "So what do you do, mate?" And I'm like, "Oh, I did law stuff in America." "Oh, yep. What's for dinner?" Like that's the end of the conversation, right? Which is fine. I get it.
Right. And so, but you, because of what you've been doing and what you've tried to do, so much more than maybe your average American citizen walking down the street, because we don't require a certain level of legal knowledge and understanding in the school system that we require kids to go through. So, so there's an education problem, and I think that's a whole other thing that needs to be addressed. And whether or not there should be some kind of Khan Academy for law type thing is something that I would support. But there's an issue spotting problem. This is what I call the issue spotting problem. And that is that we go to law school and we learn how to issue spot. We learn about what a tort is, and how to spot legal problems, contractual, issues for clients, for future clients that they can't spot themselves. And what do we do when we go out there into the world? We have to help these consumers, these future clients, issue spots. So what do we do? Well, only a few areas of law actually do this, and that is they have big giant billboards or ads on TV that say, "Hey, have you been injured? Have you been eating this thing?" I just got a spam phone call the other day saying, if you or any of your family members have taken this drug, you could be entitled to all this money.
The attorney violated the TCPA Act to inform you of your rights for a different act?
I doubt there was an attorney behind it. I doubt there was, but the point is that those are examples.
The corporate trail is not that calcified, my friend. That attorney's in trouble.
Perhaps, I don't know. It was a spam automated call, so I hung up. But the point is that that's issue spotting forced on the potential client, right? Because the clients don't necessarily know. I mean, and some of it has become so pervasive, whether it's in, news or media or entertainment, that kind of there's like a greater knowledge of certain, potential issues where somebody's like, I could sue. It's like, well, yeah, and you could sue. Maybe some rights were violated and you can sue, but do you have damages? Because if you don't have damages, it might not be worth it to sue. You could sue. Maybe you could get an injunction. Maybe you get some relief, but it's just going to cost you money. So you have to also weigh that choice, right? And a lot of clients don't understand that when you get to that next level of, do you actually pursue your rights in court?
Yeah. Or does the defendant have anything that's worth? Do they have the?
Are they collectible?
Yeah. Collectible.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. Are they collectible? So that's another thing you have to consider. So issue spotting becomes a problem, but this is where I think the subscription model can actually help. And that is, for people that have been fortunate enough to afford an attorney, unless they're like a personal injury attorney that takes most cases on contingency, you can't just call your attorney whenever you want, because the clock starts ticking. And so you can't develop a relationship with your attorney, because every time you're talking to them, it's costing you money every 6 minutes.
That's an undervisible part of your product, and I think it's really important.
Yeah. So if you could call your attorney and not have that ticking clock, and maybe there's a different type of ticking clock. Like, I've signed up for this 15, 30 minute, hour time slot to talk to my attorney. So this is the time that I get. You make the most of that time, and you're already paying for it. On the other hand, you don't know what you're going to be charged, right? It's like ordering the fish at market price, but sorry, we can't tell you what it is until after you've eaten it. Then we can tell you what the market price is, right? No one's going to order that fish. So now you could develop a relationship with your attorney, and you could call them all the time, and you could talk to them, and maybe things come up, right? I'm having this issue at work, or, my spouse and I are in a fight, or, my shower broke and I'm having a plumber and a contractor come out and they're having me sign this paperwork, and questions to ask, like, should I, and then I, as the lawyer, could say, well, are they a general contractor? Are they bringing people to the home? Do they have insurance? I could help, clients think through these questions and help them in ways that maybe they never would have thought to talk to a lawyer before. Or I'm not going to pay someone $300 an hour to ask them about this contract that this contractor's having me sign for work, that they're fixing something at my home, right? So by creating a natural back and forth where you're developing a relationship, the client's going to call you more often and you could help educate them and guide them more frequently so that when there is an issue and it will require more than just a phone call, well, now, that's where you upsell them, and maybe some more services. But it's because they're paying you every month, you're generating more revenue from them in the long run. And now you could afford to maybe offer, a little help them negotiate a contract for a small fee, a small flat fee, right?
So I've never been, I'm not an attorney, I don't pretend to be on the internet. But I can imagine that the people who sort of run attorney-related events probably sort of encourage the people in the community to develop relationships with their clients, right? They probably say things like, trust is everything. They probably say things like, know your customer, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's, I think it's super important. What this does is it sort of lowers the perceived barrier for building those relationships and building that trust, and sort of folds it into a lot more of a personal dynamic, where these sort of perceived expense spikes are sort of moderated accordingly, and it allows it to sort of basically pre-agree on, what it does? It bounds expectations prior to when the engagement, which I think is really important for both sides. And by bounding those expectations, it also allows the attorney to say, look, we're 30 minutes past, whatever. So that's all we have time for today, Stephen. But you get the idea. I think overall as well, like if I put myself in the shoes of the amount of times I've spoken to somebody and they're like, Reuben, I have a problem, can't afford an attorney, but you do law stuff. I'm like, no, I do not do law stuff. Let's have a conversation. And they're like, okay, cool. So here's my situation. I'm like, okay, here are the questions that you might want to ask yourself, or a qualified attorney and not your friend who does not do law stuff. But just even that, so that minor tiny little gap can save them presumably a few hours of freaking out, man. So a big part of this is sort of moderating the gap between expectations and reality as it applies to a knowledge base that they have no reason to sort of educate themselves around. So if we can sort of smooth that those gaps, I think that's a net positive for the aggregate stress level of America.
Right. And then maybe you get litigation avoidance, right?
The stress index. Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because people won't end up suing each other over things. If they have a lawyer they could call who could calm them down, explain the situation, maybe work out a resolution before it even ends up in the court system. So that way the things that end up in court are actual things that cannot be resolved, amicably without going to court.
Imagine. Yeah.
What a world we would be living in if that could happen. And I can't tell you how many times back when I used to actually be physically present in court, not just on Zoom, although it still happened on Zoom, is somebody appears for someone else because they're the guy or gal that they go to for legal questions. And the judge has to explain, oh, no, you can't appear on behalf of somebody else if you're not a lawyer. That's unlicensed practice of law. Nobody gets in trouble. The judge stops them. Before they're doing it. The judge doesn't let them speak on someone else's behalf. And I've never seen a repeat person do that in court. But it does happen. Sometimes it's family members. Sometimes it's, it's my spouse or it's my son, or it's my elderly mother. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, you're not a lawyer. Even if you've been helping them out, you can't actually represent them and step up here. That's where it's more common. But on occasion, you do just get like, it's my neighbor,
Wow.
or it's a family friend,
Wow.
So it
Yeah.
happens. It happens. It happens more commonly than you think.
Hmm.
So it could, that could solve that problem. And that's
Hmm.
another thing I hadn't, I hadn't thought about until you brought up that example, which I like. And feel free to interrupt me at any time. But another thing that we talked about that I want to make sure we fit in.
I have one very tiny story.
Go for it.
I acted incredulous just now until I remembered that I'm guilty of turning up, in this case, representing my corporation, which of course is not a person, and we didn't have counsel at the time for that specific context. And I turned up and they're like, Mr. Metcalfe, I understand you're here without counsel. Yes, well, as a corporation, you cannot appear without counsel.
Right.
But based on the amount that you're talking about here, and by virtue of the fact that it's on behalf of your customers, I assume that the math wouldn't work for that. How can we help? And it was, I was lucky, basically, to get an audience at all. But it's
you get one. Everybody gets one of those.
Yeah. So thanks to the 11th Circuit there.
Yeah. So something else we talked about in our pre-chat was you were referencing like it's the AAA model is a possibility of how this can be successful. So could you maybe explain that for my audience of what you were talking about there?
Yeah, sure. So does AAA collect your car when you have a breakdown?
Yeah. No, AAA does not come.
Oh, okay, cool. Awesome. Does AAA so what do they do?
You pay them money and they make sure somebody comes when there's a breakdown, right?
Yeah. And that's it. Right?
So what you're saying is there's a business model here with the subscription applied to law where you don't even necessarily need to be the lawyer per se who shows up.
No, not at all. Just pay a fee.
And depending on your state that you're in, maybe you're in one of these re-regulation states, you don't even need to be a lawyer that people are signing up with because fee splitting is kind of being relaxed and non-lawyer ownership in certain states, in Arizona and Utah right now, they're currently re-regulating where, and the different states are doing different things. They're not doing the same things, but they're a regulatory sandbox right now. And they are, and like some of them are allowing for a little bit of fee splitting or fee sharing, and some are allowing for non-attorney ownership in law firms. This law on call is one of the examples I was talking about earlier. And I think Florida is talking about doing some sort of re-regulation. I know the Chicago Bar Foundation.
Of course, Florida is doing. Yeah, of course, Florida.
Yeah, right.
Let me guess. Yeah. Don't even get started on Florida.
I know. That's a different podcast and a different episode. But even Illinois is at least considering some sort of re-regulation when it comes to what's allowed and what's not allowed with fee sharing and non-lawyer ownership in law firms. And it all comes back to access to justice. What were you saying?
Contingency?
Well, I don't know about what do you mean contingency?
Contingency, sharing fees on contingency.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure. It's all sort of new. But it's possible. It's possible. I don't know because it's so new. I can't say for sure. And since it's not happening in my state and I'm only licensed in Illinois, I don't know. But it's worth looking into Arizona and Utah if the fee sharing that they're allowing in limited circumstances would apply to contingency.
Yeah. I think I have to speak up here because I think it's a dangerous path for the country to share contingency with those who stand to benefit from starting fights, basically. I know that for some time, DC, that is Virginia, has allowed for non-attorneys to participate in the ownership of law firms based in Virginia, to the extent that they're able to sort of prove that they're contributing to perhaps the administration process of a case, and that has been imagine that happened in the DC jurisdiction. But it sounds like to the extent that there's expansion in that area, and to the extent that that expansion touches Florida, I can imagine a. I've got nothing against Florida. I think they're a fascinating jurisdiction with a wonderful history, and I like the. Florida was an independent for a long time compared to other parts of the country. We're going to go off on a tangent here, so I'll reel it back in. But
yeah, good. You stopped yourself.
I did, barely. But there is a lot of litigation that stems from that area, and a lot of data brokers, a lot of people with a lot of sort of AK-47 approaches to the market rather than sniper approaches, and it's I whilst I think it makes sense for the business part of law to stratify somewhat and allow for automation and to be able to come into and with the context of attorneys not being their strong suit being automation, I think it does make sense to allow for a vector for technology to enter into the space to make everybody's lives easier. My concern is that many of the parties who seek to engage in the practice of laws directly or indirectly aren't necessarily doing it for greater access to justice or in order to ensure outcomes more fair, adequate, and reasonable, right? But I mean, it is good to see that there's some experimentation, and I guess one hopes for there to be a net positive from, a little more flexibility in the fabric.
That's the idea, I think. And I don't know that you would have any reason to know this, but I'm pretty active in bar associations. And so I'm reading a lot about attorney responses to this. And as you can imagine, there's incredible pushback for, in part the reason that you just mentioned. I see the subscription model as a separate solution to that problem that they're trying to solve, which is the access to justice problem. They're saying, okay, the legal system, the legal services, way legal services are being provided isn't working for most people. Here's an idea. And, the state Supreme Courts and several commissions for their bar associations of those states, they're getting together, they're doing research, they're asking for, innovative ideas. And this is what some people have come up with as a potential solution to increase access to justice. Maybe going to Walmart and buying stuff and getting your eyes checked and getting your pharmacy prescription and then getting your will done. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know that it is, but maybe it is. Maybe if most people aren't able to afford that anyway, does that really impede on, an attorney's current business model? But I want to shake up the business model. And I think that by having attorneys be able to provide legal services at scale, more affordably than they could before, because they stand to make more money if you integrate technology like you were talking about, because they could bring on more clients, but they should, lawyers, but they should be lowering the cost in order to do that. And it won't be for every lawyer, but I think there are young, innovative lawyers out there who are drowning in student loan debt, myself included, and they are looking for solutions to both do what they wanted to do when they went to law school, which is, for most of them, help people, while at the same time being able to earn a comfortable living and get out of student loan debt. And so I think the subscription model is a way to do that without the need for this re-regulation that's going on. But at the same time, I'm also hopeful that good things come from it, but there's definitely a big potential dark side. And with that big potential dark side, I have one final question for you, Reuben, and that is a hot dog a sandwich?
I would like to defer. Is it okay to mention another legal podcast on this legal podcast?
Of course.
Yeah. I would defer to the sandwich specialists over at the podcast known as A Citizen's Guide to the Supreme Court, who have addressed this question on a number of occasions. And I think from recollection, I think the answer sort of as to where you lie on the D&D chart, right? Are you familiar with the D&D good and evil chart?
Yeah, good, evil, chaotic, neutral. What's the other? I can't remember the other one. Is it just chaotic, neutral, good, and evil?
Yeah. And then like
Okay.
neutral in the middle, or true neutral. Yeah.
Neutral. Right. That's where I lie. I lie in neutral. Neutral.
True neutral fan. Um, yeah, it's yeah, yep. One thing there, I think just as we were talking, I wonder whether or not, like, to these gut feeling, what do you think this number is? Monthly subscription on a consumer level.
The number that should be charged
The
for an everyday
statistically average human being in America, what do you think that monthly fee is for access to the statistical sort of bounded legal services, access to speaking to an attorney about the kinds of things that they would normally experience?
Yeah, I think context matters, and I think, but you're talking about trying to take it out of context and just look at a statistical average.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, if nobody ever listens to anything I say, the only two words I want them to take away is that context matters. But since we're taking that out of the question right now, and this will change with time, but I think you have to look at what people are typically paying for access to other subscriptions, right? Your Amazon Primes, your Netflix, your streaming services, everything else. And look at a number that people can afford, right? Mm-hmm. I even learned today about like there's this like pet insurance, like virtual.
Yeah.
You can see a pet, and that's like $20 a month, and that's what I think it is. I think it's like $20 a month if you take it out of context at a minimum. And some places it might be less, some places it might be more, but at a minimum, to just be able to get on the phone with an attorney for 15 minutes at a minimum, at least once a month. I think $20 is fair. Now there's some people that wouldn't even be able to afford that, right? And I think the subscription model can be flexible enough that you can adapt it. But I think you'd sign up a lot of people, and you'd be able to, answer their questions and develop relationships with more clients. And frankly, the people do have greater legal needs than just calling you up every once in a while and talking to you. So that would translate. But I think at a minimum, that's what they'd get for $20 a month, is at least one call, maybe more, and get access to attorney when they never had one before. And then context changes, and if that becomes a thing, maybe it's something different. But for right now, in current times, $20 a month is what is the minimum price that I'm throwing out there.
I think that's reasonable. That's reasonable. And obviously anybody listening, any attorneys who might be considering a similar path might be jumping up and down depending on their context. My gut instinct is to do two things. One is divide that, take $20, multiply that by 320 million Americans, you get 6.4 billion a month. Multiply that by 12 and ask myself whether or not America can afford that for everybody. And I think the answer is maybe, right? To the extent that the health insurance is, like, I tried to get health insurance as a private individual without one of those grown-up job things. And it was like $300 a month, $300 a month, just to not be absolutely messed up if I have a problem, right? And a lot of nations, they socialize that. Certainly we do in New Zealand. I wonder whether or not there could be some. I wonder or not two things. One, could you sell this to Geico? And two, if they won't take it, could you sell it to the government? And because that would be access to justice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, like some sort of pool, or like national fund that attorneys can tap into in the event they're taking on these types of clients who can't afford more than $20 a month, and people would essentially be paying it in their taxes ahead of time.
Exactly.
As opposed to, I mean, I'm open to that idea. I think it would typically be described as un-American, and just let the consumer go out and pick the lawyer that they want. Because I think in that situation,
who's paying the public defenders?
I know. But I'm trying to see both sides here, right? Like I said, I'm open to it, but I understand the argument on the other side, which would be let the consumer take their $20 and go and pick whatever attorney that they want to pick for that. And plus, it's difficult because there are only so many. Okay. There are only, if we were to change licensing where it wasn't limited to whatever jurisdiction you're licensed in, it would maybe be more feasible. But like right now, most of the attorneys are in, New York,
Right.
San Francisco, LA, Chicago, the big
Mm.
cities in Texas, in Florida. And so like there's not enough lawyers out there. There's 1.3 million lawyers
Okay. That's
approximately.
fair.
That's less than 0.5% of the 331 million Americans, right? Not all
Wait a minute.
331
How
million.
many?
It's 1.3 million attorneys. Isn't
Okay.
that, I
That's
believe
a
that's like 0.4 or
awesome
something
number.
percent.
Okay. So actually that was the other number. I was going to say if you take that number and divide that by 1.3 million, you get like $5,000 a month per attorney forever though, plus additional. Man, that's not bad. It's not a bad baseline though, right?
It's not. But most of those, or not most of those, but a huge portion of them are going to be underage kids though, of the 331 million, right? So how many of them are actual like adults who would go out and who could hire an attorney and not have to have their parents involved as a guardian, right? So you have to also factor that in. So it's not like it
Okay.
wouldn't split up
Okay.
quite
That's
that
fair.
much.
Okay. No, that's fair. So like, I mean, I don't know about you, but there's people in America that live on $2 a day. There's a
Yeah.
cool book on that called $2 a day
Mm-hmm.
if you want to feel sad for a little while, but inspired for the future. Um, let's say that it's $3,000 a month. That seems like that's rent anywhere in America, pretty much. Like maybe it's a studio in San Francisco, but generally speaking, um, that number feels reasonable enough to be able to scale broadly enough to fix some of the largest problems in access to justice is in America. If I had to guess, right, and this is just some random non-attorney thinking about this stuff, but I think it's really exciting. I wonder. It's also the kind of thing that like an endowment could just shove a bunch of money into, and on the other side be like, yeah, we helped like 100,000 people have attorneys for some time.
There's something called the Legal Services Corporation.
Oh yeah,
and
okay,
the Legal Services Corporation is essentially that. It's the government allocates. I think it's around. It's somewhere in the hundreds of millions a year, which it's way less than it used to be. It's way less than it used to be. And Legal Services Corporation goes out to like organizations that help, with pro bono or people that otherwise can't get access to legal services. But it has not been enough money. But that's also, they're going places where they don't have, they can't invest in like good technology, to be more efficient about it. Right. And so that money runs out very fast, unfortunately.
are you familiar with Cypre?
What is that?
This is a class action thing. Um, and so for context, only 1 in 14 claims is filed, right? If you look back at the indirect lithium ion battery settlement from about a year ago, it was a $310 million settlement from recollection, maybe 320, run by Huggins Berman, and they learned that the lithium ion battery outfits were price fixing, right? And so that made everybody's batteries cost more, which made the devices cost more. And if you had purchased any device between the years 2000 and 2011, you are eligible for a claim of X dollars, as defined by how many devices, cordless drills, I don't know, any phone that you purchased over a 10-year period, and remotes, all that kind of stuff, right? It's about $10-20 claim per person. And the class size of 320 million was like 319 million times. I don't know who is not having a phone over a 10-year period, okay? But our customers at the time, apparently 8% decided that they hadn't purchased anything with a battery in it over a 10-year period. I don't know what they were doing, but they weren't using our product because most people use it on a phone, which is fine. Point being, that whole settlement of 300 million person class, 1 million people filed a claim, and 90,000 of those were ours, which is a 0.3% claims rate. So 99.97% of people who should have got the money didn't. So where does the money go? Well, in this case, it was distributed pro rata about those who filed a claim. In many class actions, there's a cap where after a certain amount on a per person basis, they'll only get, it won't be distributed pro rata purely. There'll be a bunch left over. So the question is, where does that go? The worst cases have it go back to the defendant. Those are reversionary funds, and it is a breeding ground for corruption. And if you see a reversionary fund, make a bunch of noise, point at it, and call it for what it is, because it's BS. That's what it is. The less worse option is it goes to cyprès, which is a legal French term, being, I think it's like the nearest to, right? And so, like, if there, let's say that there's a cancer class action, cancer medication class action rather. It's very hard to sue cancer. It doesn't respond very well. But let's say that this cancer medication turns out to accelerate it, and in fact, it accelerates it so much that there's not a lot of plaintiffs by the time you actually get to court. In that case, you can't. The cyprès might be the National Cancer Society, right, where any unclaimed funds goes back to the cause, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't this sound like the kind of thing that cyprès could go to? Further access to justice across the board for all those unclaimed funds and class actions?
For an evenly distributed fund for access to attorneys that are paid on a month. They're paid the same amount every month in order to service so many clients based on that amount.
Yeah.
From like a government perspective, like take the subscription model and apply it to government for attorneys and access to justice. It's an interesting thing, and frankly, I think you could get attorneys who could sign up for it because they don't have to close down their current practice or change the way their current practice is. They could supplement their practice with serving these people, getting paid from this fund. But it's an idea. It's a really interesting
From
idea.
Each according to their calculated corporate non-compliance to each according to their needs.
Right. Interesting. That is where I want to end it. That's super interesting. So Reuben, thank you so much for coming. If anyone wants to get in touch with you or follow up with you about some of the fascinating ideas that you have, what's the best way for my listeners to reach you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Reuben Metcalfe. So RUBEN. Just look at the podcast notes. You'll see me. And also, I'm particularly interested in music stuff coming up. I think music could use a bit of a shake-up, and looking into copyright and all sorts of interesting things around that. So if anybody knows about music-y, copyrighty law things, I'd love to speak to them. And then outside of that, it has been a distinct pleasure, sir. I look forward to catching up in the future.
Thanks again to 650 and Gavel for sponsoring this show. The best way for others to discover this show is for you to share it with someone you think would find value from it. Follow me on LinkedIn, since that's where I'm most active on social media, and click the bell towards the top right of my profile to get notified about all of my posts about this podcast and everything else I think is valuable for you to see. To get in touch, message me on LinkedIn or email Kerbis@lawsubscribed.com. All links are in the show notes. Until next time, this is Matthew Kerbis with Law Subscribed.